Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. In today's story, we follow the journey of a mother who gave everything for her children, only to be betrayed and left to navigate her own future. With determination, strength, and a heart still full of love, she faces the unimaginable and works to rebuild her broken family. Join us as we explore the emotional twists and turns of life, loss, and the power of second chances. Please subscribe to the channel to begin today's story with life stories. I never thought I'd be sitting here, in this nursing home, recounting the twists and turns of my life. It's funny how things change, isn't it? One minute you're walking down the aisle of a quaint little church in San Francisco, your heart brimming with hope, your mind filled with dreams of a perfect future. I can still feel the warmth of the California sun on my face. Smell the fragrance of the roses that adorned the pews. Oh, how naive I was back then, thinking I had it all figured out. If someone had told me on that day, as I stood there in my white dress, that I'd end up raising Ethan and Noah all by myself, I would have laughed it off as some kind of cruel joke. But life, as we all know, has its own plans. It's like a roller coaster, taking you on unexpected twists and turns, leaving you breathless, and sometimes heartbroken. I remember dreaming of a future filled with happiness and stability, just like any newlywed couple. We had it all mapped out, the house with the white picket fence, family barbecues on Sundays, yearly vacations to Disneyland. But oh, how quickly those dreams can shatter. Life has a way of teaching us that no one is immune to adversity. I learned that lesson the hard way, feeling like I'd been thrown into the deep end without a life jacket. I look back now, and I wonder if I missed the warning signs. How could I have been so blind to the man I married? James was the kind of man who was always there when the cameras were on, always smiling for the world to see. But behind closed doors, he was different. I don't think I ever saw it coming. One day, just like that, he was gone. He left a note on the kitchen counter. It was short, cold, and full of excuses. His new partner didn't want children, just her own. So, he left Ethan and Noah for me to raise alone. He promised financial help. But let me tell you, that check never came. After the divorce papers arrived, I felt like I had been hit by a freight train. Relief and despair fought a battle in my heart. My hands shook as I held those papers. How could he abandon us like this? The first few days were a blur of emotions. But in that moment, I had to be strong. I had no choice but to understand this new reality. I had to be both mother and father, even if it felt impossible. Ethan, my oldest, tried so hard to put on a brave face. I can still hear him asking, "Mom, we're going to be okay, right?" Trying to hide his own fear. Little Noah, bless his heart, didn't fully grasp what was happening, but he felt his father's absence like a missing puzzle piece. I knew I had to be strong for them, and the thought kept nagging at me. What if something happens to me? What'll become of them? I started burning the midnight oil, looking for any extra work I could find. I told the boys, "You two deserve the best," as I signed them up for every activity under the sun. I was determined to give them all the opportunities one never had. I tried to be both mom and dad, to fill the James-shaped hole he left behind. They can't want for anything, I told myself, even as I felt the weight of this double duty crushing me. My own life, that took a backseat. Friends and family, bless their hearts, would say, "Emily, you deserve to be happy too. Why don't you find someone new?" But the thought of bringing a stranger into my boys' lives terrified me. How could I trust anyone after what happened? I couldn't risk my children's happiness. I'd lie awake at night, thinking if their own flesh and blood could abandon them, how could I ever trust a stranger to care for them? I didn't want to admit it, even to myself. But James's actions hadn't just hurt the boys, they cut me deep too. I'd loved that man with every fiber of my being. I never saw that betrayal coming. Unlike many folks, I didn't have the luxury of time to deal with my own pain and emotions. Too many worries. You see, I buried those feelings deep down in my soul. Tried to bury them as far as they'd go. I made up my mind to cut ties with the past and not to dwell on it. The future. That was where I had to focus. But getting there meant solving new problems every single day. Let me tell you. Raising 2 kids alone, it's no walk in the park. Boys and girls are as different as night and day. Sometimes I struggled to understand Ethan and Noah. To accept them. To help them. To protect them. It didn't always work out. But, Lord knows, I tried every single day. This journey has been tough. It's made me who I am. And you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. But never did I think my overwhelming worry and desire to compensate for their father's absence would backfire like this. Ethan and Noah. They've grown into such selfish young men. It breaks my heart. To them, I'm nothing but a resource. A means to an end. Their favorite word. I want. The balance of give and take in our family is completely out of whack. I've given my all. Everything I have. And everything I am. But it's never enough. They just keep taking, always wanting more. When they hit their teens, things really went downhill. Any respect they had for me as their mother, it just about disappeared. When they were little, they were happy to let me shoulder all the responsibility. And oh, how that fed my guilt. Now, when we argue, they know just how to twist the knife. They'll shout that their father left because of me, using it as a weapon to end the fight and come out on top. They've learned that playing the blame game is a mighty effective way to manipulate me. In my quieter moments, I can't help but wonder, did I fail them somehow? Maybe I wasn't strict enough. Maybe I didn't say the right words at the right time. I love those boys so much. And I'm terrified of hurting them even more than they already are. But at this point, what's done is done. As my mother used to say, what's bred in the bone will come out in the flesh. From a young age, Ethan and Noah have been ruled by their emotions, making decisions with their hearts instead of their heads. I've faced so many challenges with them. But when push comes to shove, they always come running back to mommy for help. With my mother's heart, I can't turn them away or set firm boundaries. So I always give in. Despite their difficult behavior and self-centeredness. When I first became a single mother, I never anticipated how much the strain would affect every aspect of my life. As much as I loved Ethan and Noah, and as determined as I was to raise them well, I found myself fighting a constant battle against exhaustion, fear, and the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to end. James's departure had left a hole in our family, and no matter how much I tried to fill it, it never quite seemed enough. The emotional burden I carried on my shoulders was crushing. But I didn't have the luxury of showing weakness. I had to be strong. Even when my heart ached. Even when I felt alone. I remember the first few months after James left, how I buried myself in work and took on every possible responsibility to keep our household running. Ethan, being the oldest, often tried to step up. I could see him struggling to balance his role as the man of the house with his own need for security. He was trying to hold it together for Noah, who, at 6 years old, didn't fully understand why his father wasn't there anymore. It was heartbreaking to watch, and I could see the weight of it in Ethan's eyes. He began to act out, and as he entered his teenage years, things only worsened. The boy who once came to me with every little scrape and problem now barely spoke to me. I was nothing more than a convenience to him. Someone who provided food, shelter, and the occasional allowance. It was as if the love I had poured into him, the sacrifices I had made, had simply been forgotten. Noah, on the other hand, was more outwardly rebellious. He had trouble understanding his emotions and would lash out at me whenever I tried to push him into doing anything he didn't want to do. But even then, I couldn't help but see that, deep down, he was just as lost and hurt as Ethan. They both had scars from the abandonment. And yet, neither of them had the words to express how they were feeling. It was a constant struggle for me to connect with them. The harder I tried, the more they pulled away. And with that distance came a profound sense of guilt. What was I doing wrong? Was I not enough? Was I failing them? These thoughts plagued me, especially in the quiet moments when I was alone with my fears. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for them, trying to fill the gaps left by James's absence. I signed them up for every after-school activity I could find, hoping it would keep them busy and give them a sense of accomplishment. I wanted to give them everything I had never had, to make sure they felt loved and supported despite everything. But it never seemed to be enough. I remember one evening, when Noah was about 13, sitting him down and trying to have a heart-to-heart with him. I was desperate to understand what he was going through. I asked him how he felt about his father not being around, and what came out of his mouth left me speechless. "I don't care," he said, his voice flat. "It's better without him. You're all I need, Mom." And yet, there was a sadness in his eyes that contradicted his words. He was angry. But it wasn't just anger at James, it was anger at the world. At the situation we found ourselves in. He was angry at me for not being able to fix it. Ethan's rebellion, however, was more subtle. He would retreat into his room for hours, listening to music or playing video games, often shutting me out when I tried to talk to him. He'd rarely join us for meals. And when he did, the conversation was brief and cold. The boy who used to tell me everything now barely acknowledged my presence. I tried everything I could think of, talking to him, bribing him with rewards for good grades, even taking him out for one-on-one outings to try and reconnect. But nothing worked. It was as if a wall had gone up between us. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through. The pressure of it all became overwhelming. I was doing everything I could to hold the family together. But it felt like the harder I tried, the further away they slipped from me. And then there was the constant reminder that I was alone in this. I didn't have a partner to help share the burden. I didn't have anyone to lean on when I felt like I was drowning. My friends and family, bless their hearts, would offer words of encouragement, telling me that I deserved to be happy too, that I should try dating again, or take some time for myself. But I couldn't imagine letting anyone into our lives after everything we'd been through. The thought of trusting someone again was terrifying. How could I risk the happiness of my boys by bringing another man into our lives, knowing that they had already been hurt once? At night, when I lay awake, my mind raced with worries. What if something happened to me? What would become of Ethan and Noah? Would they turn out okay? Or would they end up just like James, selfish, cold, and unwilling to take responsibility for their actions? I wanted to protect them from that fate, but I wasn't sure I had the strength to do it alone. Raising two boys into men was proving to be much harder than I ever imagined. I constantly questioned whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was making the right choices for them. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't give up on them. No matter how hard it got, no matter how much they pushed me away, I had to keep trying. As the days passed, the relationship between us grew more strained. The gap between us widened, and I felt like I was losing them more and more. They seemed to have no respect for me as their mother anymore. And yet, I couldn't give up on them. They were my sons. And as difficult as it was, I knew I had to keep fighting for them, even when it felt like they didn't care. What was I supposed to do? Let them go? Let them fall apart like James had? No. I wasn't going to let that happen. When I was diagnosed with a serious illness, I thought the world was collapsing in on me. It felt like a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. The doctor's words echoed in my mind: "It's not a matter of if, but when." I tried to hold myself together for Ethan and Noah. But deep down, I felt the weight of it all pressing on me. The thought of leaving them behind, unprepared for the world, was unbearable. I had been their everything, their provider, their protector. Now, what would they do without me? I remember the moment I told them. It was a quiet evening, and we were sitting at the dinner table. the air thick with unspoken tension. I had been avoiding telling them for as long as I could. But I knew I couldn't keep the secret forever. Ethan, already distant, barely lifted his head from his plate. Noah, on the other hand, had a sharpness in his eyes, as if he could sense something was wrong. I hesitated for a moment, but then the words came out. Heavy and real. I'm sick. Boys. I don't know how much time I have left. For a moment. Neither of them said anything. It was as if they were waiting for me to make it better. To tell them I was lying. But I wasn't. Ethan finally looked up. His face expressionless. As if he'd heard those words 1,000 times before. What does that mean for us? Mom, he asked. His voice flat. Almost bored. And that's when it hit me, neither of them was really concerned about my health. They were more worried about themselves. How would this affect their lives? What would happen to them? It was a gut punch. Noah, on the other hand, didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. But he could sense something was wrong. He asked a series of questions. But they were all about whether I would be able to drive him to practice or help him with his homework. He didn't ask about my condition, my treatment, or my feelings. It was all about his own life, his own needs. I was their mother, their caretaker. But at that moment, I felt invisible to them. As the weeks passed, the reality of my illness set in. I couldn't hide it anymore. My body wasn't cooperating, and the pain was becoming harder to ignore. I needed help. But when I asked Ethan and Noah to step up, I was met with resistance. They were more concerned with their own lives than with mine. Ethan, the one who I thought would be my pillar of support, had become increasingly absorbed in his own world. His grades were slipping, and he was always out with friends, never offering to help around the house. Noah, though more eager to please, lacked the maturity to take on any real responsibility. He would offer to help but then forget, or get distracted by something else. One evening, I found myself in the kitchen, barely able to stand. I'd been trying to make dinner, but my body was protesting. The exhaustion was overwhelming. I called out to Ethan, asking him to come help me carry the groceries inside. But he didn't answer. I found him in his room, headphones in, playing video games. Ethan, I called, my voice tinged with frustration. He barely looked up. Can't you see I'm busy? He muttered. I wanted to scream, to shake him and tell him everything I had been carrying. But instead, I just stood there, feeling defeated. It wasn't long before I realized that asking for help, pleading for attention, was pointless. The more I tried to depend on them, the more they pulled away. It was like I had become a burden to them, a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be cared for. They couldn't see beyond their own needs, their own discomfort. It was as though the years of love and care I had given them meant nothing. In their eyes, I had become just another obstacle in their way. I had failed them, and they had failed me. One night, I was sitting in the living room, feeling sick and alone, when the phone rang. It was from the nursing home. My heart sank. I knew it wasn't good news. It was about a new treatment I had been considering, and I needed to make a decision soon. But as I tried to explain the situation to Ethan and Noah, their indifference was palpable. I don't know, Mom, Ethan said, barely looking up from his phone. You'll figure it out. Noah, who had been playing with his toys, didn't even respond. It was like I was speaking to a wall. In that moment, I realized just how alone I really was. My own children, the ones I had sacrificed so much for, had abandoned me emotionally. They were no longer the innocent little boys who would run to me with open arms. They had grown into selfish young men, focused solely on their own desires and futures, with no regard for the woman who had raised them, loved them, and given them everything she had. They didn't even care enough to ask about my health or offer comfort. I was just a shadow in their lives, a fading memory of a time when they needed me. As I sat there in the silence, my heart broke. I didn't know how things had gotten so bad. But the realization hit me hard. My children had become strangers, and I was left with nothing but the weight of my illness and the emptiness of their absence. They had taken everything, my house, my money, my dignity, but they couldn't take away my spirit. I still had that. And that was something they would never be able to take from me. I was still their mother, even if they didn't see me that way anymore. And somehow, that gave me the strength to carry on. Despite everything, I knew I had to keep fighting, not for them, but for me. Because if I didn't, then I would truly be lost. 3 years had passed since the day I was diagnosed with my illness. And in that time, I had come to terms with the fact that I was slowly being pushed out of my own life. Ethan and Noah had grown more distant, more absorbed in their own worlds. And I had faded into the background. I wasn't the mother they once relied on. Now, I was just an inconvenience to them. A reminder of all they had taken for granted. I had accepted this, for the most part. But deep down, I knew I would never give up on them completely. It was during one of those long, silent nights when I received a call that I wasn't expecting. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Hannah, a notary's assistant, and asked if I was Emily Johnson. The mention of my name caught my attention, and when she mentioned a secret will, my heart began to race. A secret will? I repeated, confused. What are you talking about? Hannah explained that the will was related to my late brother Tyler, and she needed to speak to me about it in person. She was very vague about the details, but the mere mention of a will and the fact that it was something I didn't know about piqued my curiosity. Tyler, my brother, had been living in another state for years, and I hadn't heard much from him since his passing. He had struggled with life, always trying to find his footing, but it was the news of his marriage to a wealthy woman that had made headlines in our family. I knew he'd inherited a sizable fortune, but the details were always kept behind closed doors. I didn't want to get my hopes up, but a small part of me wondered if this was a chance for things to finally go right. Could there be something left for me? After all, a small inheritance. Perhaps. To make up for everything I had lost over the years. Maybe this would be my moment. My chance to feel valued again. I immediately called Ethan, telling him about the conversation. At first, he seemed uninterested, but as I pressed him for more details, he became more curious. He was never one to let an opportunity slip through his fingers. Let's find out more, he said, his tone shifting. Maybe there's something there we can use. Noah, too, was intrigued, although his attitude was more skeptical. This sounds fishy. Mom, he said, what if it's just some scam? Why would a notary's assistant be calling out of the blue? Despite Noah's concerns, Ethan insisted that they investigate. And so, the plans were made to meet with Hannah, the notary's assistant, at a nearby cafe. When I arrived, I saw the two of them sitting there, nervously tapping their fingers on the table. They looked like a couple of schoolboys caught in a lie. I sat down with them, and the conversation quickly turned to the will. Hannah explained that she had been appointed to deliver the news of Tyler's estate to the rightful heir, which, according to her, was me. She also mentioned that Tyler had passed away some time ago and that his estate had been left to me, as there had been no children from his marriage. My mind was reeling. Tyler's estate? My brother's wealth? This was the kind of news I had never expected, and it left me feeling both hopeful and fearful. But the more I listened to Hannah, the more I realized something didn't sit right. She was too eager, too polished, and her words seemed rehearsed. I tried to maintain my composure, but inside, I was struggling to understand what was happening. It seemed too good to be true, and as much as I wanted to believe it, I had learned long ago not to trust too easily. As I asked more questions, the details grew murkier. Hannah was vague, dodging specifics and leaving much to the imagination. She mentioned that there were assets, several properties, houses, and cars, but no clear explanation of how they would be divided. The more she spoke, the more I realized something was off. It was like watching a house of cards being built, only for the whole thing to collapse in slow motion. It became apparent that this was not an innocent conversation, it was a test. A test of my reaction. What were Ethan and Noah expecting? What had they hoped to gain from all of this? I could see it in their eyes as they exchanged glances, greed, impatience, and a desire to take what was rightfully theirs. The inheritance, they thought, would be their ticket to a better life. A way to regain the time they had lost with me, and to finally be free from the burden they had imposed on themselves. But little did they know, this was all a setup. I waited for the right moment to confront them. When Hannah left to take a phone call, I looked at my sons, and for the first time in years, I saw them for what they truly were: selfish, desperate, and blinded by their own desires. They had wanted to manipulate me, to get what they thought they were owed without a second thought about the emotional cost it would have on me. And that's when I decided to make my move. I told them everything. Right then and there, I revealed the truth behind the so-called inheritance, explaining that it was all an act, something I had orchestrated to test their loyalty and to see if they truly cared for me, not for what they could gain from me. The shock on their faces was priceless. For the first time, they were forced to confront their actions, to face the truth that they had been so easily manipulated by their own greed. The anger that had been building inside me for years finally came to the surface. It was time for them to see the damage they had caused, to understand the hurt they had inflicted. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't about the inheritance, the money, or the properties. It was about the love and trust that had been lost between us. I had to make them see that, even though they had taken everything from me, they could still redeem themselves. But it would take more than just words, it would take actions, commitment, and a willingness to change. It was a painful revelation for both them and me, but it was necessary. And so, the real test began. Could they make amends? Could they find the strength to admit their wrongs and rebuild the broken bonds of family? Only time would tell. But as I sat there, looking at my sons, now fully aware of the consequences of their actions, I knew that this was the beginning of a long, difficult journey back to the love and understanding we had once shared. The revelation of the so-called inheritance had left Ethan and Noah in a state of disbelief. And while I could sense the shame creeping into their hearts, I knew this was only the beginning of the real work that needed to be done. I had exposed the lie. But now came the most difficult part. Could they genuinely change? Could they truly understand the depth of their betrayal? Not only to me but to the family we once were? The days after that moment of confrontation were tense. Ethan and Noah avoided me at first, unsure of how to approach me after everything I had uncovered. But the silence between us was a sharp contrast to the anger and pain that had once filled our home. It was as if we were all walking on eggshells, not knowing how to bridge the chasm that had formed between us. I had spent so many years loving them, sacrificing for them, and hoping they would grow into responsible, compassionate men. And yet, in that instant, I felt like I was staring at strangers. Strangers who had once been my children. They had become consumed with their own lives, blinded by greed, and now they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Ethan, always the more independent of the two, was the first to approach me. I could see the guilt in his eyes as he sat down next to me one evening. He was quieter than usual, his words measured. "Mom, I don't know what to say," he started, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I've been an idiot. I took you for granted. And I thought that everything you did for me was just what you were supposed to do. I never thought about how much it hurt you." The honesty in his words hit me harder than I expected. There was a vulnerability in Ethan that I hadn't seen in years. And for the first time in a long while, I could see that he wasn't just the selfish young man I had feared he had become. He was still my son, struggling to make sense of his actions, His regrets. I'm sorry. Mom, he added, his voice breaking slightly. I was wrong. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I didn't know how to respond at first. My heart was torn between the hurt I had felt and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point we needed. But before I could say anything, Noah came in. His face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and shame. I didn't think it would come to this, he muttered, his hands fumbling with his phone. I've been a fool too. Mom. I didn't realize how much I'd hurt you until now. His voice was small, like a child seeking reassurance. I thought I could live my life without thinking about anyone else. But now, I see how wrong I was. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm sorry. For a moment, the three of us just sat there in silence. The room felt different somehow, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. Ethan and Noah, for the first time in years, seemed to acknowledge the emotional cost of their actions. And I knew that this wasn't going to be easy. Forgiveness wasn't going to come overnight. But I could see the genuine remorse in their eyes. This was a turning point. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Slowly but surely, Ethan and Noah started to take more responsibility. Ethan, who had been so focused on his own life, began helping out more around the house. He would spend time with me, doing small things like bringing in groceries or fixing things around the house that had been left broken for far too long. It wasn't much, but it was a start that meant more to me than he could ever know. Noah, too, began to open up more. He would come to me with questions, ask for advice, even help with things I had been struggling with on my own. It was as though, bit by bit, they were peeling back the layers of anger, guilt, and fear that had built up between us. They were trying to show me that they could be better, that they could be the sons I had always hoped they would become. But there was still one thing hanging over us all: the past. The betrayal. The hurt. The broken promises. Those weren't things that could be erased overnight. And I knew that the real test of our progress wouldn't come from the small gestures or words of apology. It would come from how we moved forward, from how they took responsibility not just for their actions, but for their roles in healing our family. One afternoon, as we sat together in the living room, I looked at them, my two sons, and asked them a question that had been weighing on my heart. What do you really want? Ethan, what do you want? Noah. They both looked at me, unsure of how to answer. Ethan spoke first, his voice steady but unsure. I want to fix what I've broken. Mom, I want to be there for you the way I should have been from the beginning. Noah nodded, his eyes filled with sincerity. I want to prove that I can be a good son to you. I've wasted too much time being selfish. I smiled softly, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Well, that's a start, I said. But you have to show me, not just tell me. Actions speak louder than words. You've got a long way to go, but I'm willing to try if you are. It wasn't an easy road ahead, and I knew it wouldn't be, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The love that had been lost between us was beginning to find its way back. One small step at a time. It was going to take time, patience, and understanding. But maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what we had lost. And in that rebuilding, perhaps we would all learn the true meaning of family, not the superficial, transactional relationships that had driven us apart, but the deep, unconditional love that could heal even the deepest wounds. As I sat there with my sons, I realized that redemption wasn't just for them, it was for me too. I had to believe that it was never too late for second chances, for new beginnings. It wasn't about the inheritance, the money, or the properties anymore. It was about us, together, rebuilding our family from the ground up, piece by piece. Rebuilding was never going to be an easy journey. It wasn't going to be a smooth, straightforward path where everything fell back into place simply because we had recognized our mistakes. The road was rocky, filled with moments of doubt, and always fraught with reminders of how far we had strayed from the kind of family we once were. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, like the chasm between us was finally starting to narrow. Ethan and Noah both tried, in their own ways, to prove their sincerity. Ethan started spending more time with me, taking responsibility around the house, and helping with the things that I could no longer do on my own. Noah, who had always been more reactive than proactive, began to open up more, sharing his fears and hopes for the future. For the first time, I felt like I was getting glimpses of the men they could become. But there were also days when it felt like we were back at square one. Old patterns crept back in. I'd ask them to do something, and they would drag their feet. Or they would make excuses for why they couldn't help. The underlying resentment I had for how they treated me, especially when they abandoned me so easily to begin with, flared up. Sometimes, I found myself questioning whether they were truly changed or just pretending to be in order to smooth things over. The real test of whether we could move forward came one afternoon, when Ethan and Noah had been particularly distant, slipping back into their old habits of ignoring me when they were home. I had been feeling ill that day, and instead of offering help, they stayed out of the house, avoiding my calls for assistance. I was frustrated. The wound they had created in my heart was still so raw, and the bitterness of it hadn't fully healed. I was angry, not just at their behavior, but at myself for continuing to believe they could change. That evening, after dinner, I sat them down, my voice trembling with emotion as I tried to keep my composure. "I need to know," I began, looking each of them in the eye. "Are you truly sorry for what you did? Are you truly trying to change? Or are you just doing this because you think it's what I want to hear?" The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, while Noah avoided my gaze. The silence stretched on, and I could feel my heart breaking all over again. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet and unsure. "I am sorry, Mom. I don't want to hurt you anymore, but it's hard to know how to fix everything." His words were a balm, but the pain still lingered. "It's not just about words, Ethan," I replied, my voice strained. "It's about actions. You can't keep saying you're sorry and then do nothing to show it. You can't keep making excuses. I've given everything I had to you. I just need you to show me you're trying. That's all I'm asking." Noah finally spoke up, his voice softer than usual. "We don't know how, Mom," he admitted. "We're not perfect. We've made mistakes. But we're trying. It's not easy for us. We've never been through anything like this before." And there it was, the raw honesty I had been waiting for. It wasn't easy for them either. They were struggling just as much as I was, trying to understand how to make things right, how to be the sons I had always dreamed they would be. But that was the problem, they had never had to work at it before. They had always been my responsibility, my burden to carry. Now, the roles were reversed, and it was time for them to step up. As I looked at them, I realized something. I had spent so much of my life giving to them, nurturing them, and sacrificing my own happiness for their well-being. I had been the one to carry the weight of the family, and it had taken a toll on me. But now, I had to let go of the expectation that they would be perfect. I had to let go of the guilt I had carried for so long, guilt for not being enough, guilt for not being able to protect them from their own mistakes. It wasn't my responsibility to fix everything for them. They were adults now, and it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. We sat in silence for a long while, each of us processing the weight of the conversation. Finally, I spoke again, my voice steady. "I'm not perfect either, and I'm not asking you to be. I just want us to be honest with each other, to do better, and to be a family again. We may never be the same as we once were, but we can still make something good out of what we have left." Ethan nodded, and for the first time in years, I saw something shift in his eyes, something that wasn't just guilt or obligation. It was a glimmer of hope. A recognition that maybe, just maybe, we could still heal. Noah seemed to come around as well, his posture softening as if the tension in his shoulders had been released. We didn't have all the answers, and I knew it wasn't going to be an easy journey, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page, like we could work together to rebuild our fractured family. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The next few weeks were filled with small changes. Ethan started coming home earlier, and he began to take more of an active role in the household. Noah, too, started to take responsibility for his actions, even if it was in small ways, helping out more, showing up when I needed him, and listening when I needed to talk. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the days passed, I began to notice a shift in my own heart as well. I wasn't so quick to react with frustration or anger. I wasn't holding on to the past in the same way. I realized that I was learning to not just to forgive them, but to forgive myself. We were all learning how to navigate this new chapter together. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when it felt like we were back at square one. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to give up on them. And more importantly, I wasn't going to give up on myself. We were all broken in some way, but we still had the chance to heal and rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, that thought gave me hope. As I sit here today, surrounded by the echoes of the past, I realize that life has a way of throwing challenges at us when we least expect it. The journey with Ethan and Noah has been long and painful, but it has also been filled with growth, understanding, and the rekindling of love. We've come a long way from the broken family we were, and though there are still hurdles to overcome, we now know the importance of honesty, forgiveness, and unwavering support for one another. The road to redemption is never easy, but it's a road worth traveling. I've learned that no matter how many times we fall, we have the power to rise again, stronger than before. This chapter is far from over, but I'm hopeful for what lies ahead. Thank you for following my story. Please subscribe to the channel to keep up with more life stories.